Welcome to the One CA Podcast. This is Jack Gaines. Today, I'm not your host. I'm traveling in India, but I'm adding the Sitar Beach for your enjoyment. Your host today is Mr. Assad Raza, who is talking with retired Colonel Frank Sobchak. Frank studied the Iraq military collapse against ISIS and the Afghan military collapse against the Taliban. In each case, a few units bucked the trend and fought masterfully against the enemy. Frank Sobchak researched those units to find the difference. Now that he has the results, he and Assad will discuss their findings. Also, check out the show notes for links to books and their LinkedIn bios. And now, over to Assad.
Welcome to the One CA Podcast. I'm your host, Assad Raza. Today we're talking with Colonel retired Frank Sobchak, the co-author of the U.S. Army and Iraq War Report, and is currently the chair of the Irregular Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He recently conducted research and his special forces had partnered with in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I think everyone's going to want to hear. So welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Raz. I really appreciate you having me on. It's quite an honor. So I was studying at Fletcher School, and what I wanted to look at, to me, there was an interesting mystery about special forces operations, kind of a riddle. And that riddle was when we looked at the situations in, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the U.S. spent approximately $85 billion trying to produce, an Afghan military. In Iraq, we spent about $63 billion to produce the Iraqi military. And literally within days, both militaries effectively collapsed as soon as they faced the first real opposition or first real test of their tenure, except for a couple organizations. In the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, those organizations were the ISAF, the commandos and the ICTF. In Afghanistan, it was the Afghan commandos. And those organizations fought to the very end. The Afghan commandos were many of the elements that were holding the gates at Kabul International Airport. As their country literally disintegrated around them, they kept fighting. In Iraq, ISAF was really the only force that was holding back Daesh or ISIS as it was marching across northern Iraq. For one example, the Beji oil refinery, ISAF seized key terrain. They did a helicopter air assault, multi-ship mission, which again, it's like, wow, like just that itself is like, okay. But by themselves, seize the key terrain, hold out there for 2 weeks, basically blocking Daesh from moving further. Daesh sends a emissary in and says, hey, you know what? If you guys just surrender and just decide to move on, you won't fight it. You just want to be able to progress. They, literally refused, kind of almost like a battle of the bulge, like nuts. And they kept fighting there and basically blocked Daesh from moving on Baghdad. So my question became like, okay, well, what gives? What made these two units effective? Why were they outliers? What was so different about the training or the selection or what that made them capable forces and the rest of the military is effectively collapsed? And so I looked at 5 variables within that. I also selected 3 other case studies. I looked at Colombia, El Salvador, and the Philippines to kind of, further round out the different case studies. All of them were trained by U.S. Army Special Forces, and the host nation forces were considered among the elite of the host nation. So they weren't just your standard regular Army unit. They were host nation special operations forces to kind of make an apples to apples comparison. And so when I looked at those forces to see what made them different, the factors I looked at were the advisors allowed to advise in combat? Was there a match in the language training and cultural awareness of the advisors with the host nation forces? What was the ratio of the host nation soldiers to advisors? Kind of like the student-teacher ratio, right? Also looked at what was the consistency in the advisor and host nation soldier pairing? How often did the same advisors come back and work with the same host nation forces? And then finally, were the advisors allowed to organize, or to what degree were they allowed to organize the host nation forces? In other words, if they wanted to select a leader, could they pick a leader? If they wanted to, for example, make a team of 12 or 14 soldiers, were they allowed to do that? Or was the host nation saying, nope, that's my call, this is host nation sovereignty, I'm making the decision. And so kind of as I peeled the onion back on this question and I started to look at the variable of language training and cultural awareness of the advisors, I kind of came upon another riddle. And that second riddle was that when looking at the case, for example, in Iraq, you had multiple groups training the ISOF. You had fifth group, which was regionally oriented to the Middle East, to CENTCOM AOR, was probably about 30, maybe 40%, constituted 30 to 40% of the advisory time. 10th group, which was regionally oriented to EUCOM, constituted about another 35 to 40%, roughly equal to fifth group's time. Then the other groups between the National Guard groups and first group, which is regionally oriented to Asia, third group, which is generally regionally oriented to Africa, and seventh group also all contributed. With, again, only about 30% of the advisors spoke any Arabic whatsoever. In Afghanistan, the situation was even more telling because, again, you did have almost all the groups advising the Afghan commandos, but there were fewer individuals who spoke the host nation language, whether it be Dari, Pashto, or whatever, Urdu or whatever. Seventh group, regionally oriented to Latin America, spoke Spanish. Some Brazilian Portuguese, but almost very, very little of the Afghan languages. You had a couple, and there were phases where, kind of like for a fad almost, where leadership would try to train them up on it. But there was this weird also perception that, oh, we'll be out of Afghanistan in 2 or 3 years, so there's no reason to retool the language skills. So you ended up, with guys who spoke Spanish advising the Afghan commandos. The third group, generally regionally oriented to Africa, which again provided the other lion's share of the advisors, was for a short time period, for a couple of years, it was oriented to Afghanistan. But it was this also weird situation where they were regionally oriented, but the language school didn't quite catch up. And then by the time that the group regionally oriented back to Africa, that was finally when the first advisors were showing up. And then they decided, okay, we're dumping this in the language school too. So really, you had a very small number of advisors. And so that to me was, it created, a question, kind of a riddle. It's like, I'm a linguist, and I felt, to my heart, the importance of knowing the host nation language. But it created a riddle to me that, wait a minute, these two super effective combat forces most of the advisors didn't speak the host nation language. So what gives? Like, what is that really the case? So I wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into that. And that's kind of what got me to this point, to kind of answer your question of, what led me to explore it.
Thank you, Frank. Out of curiosity, my assumption is because you focused on the two soft forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. Did your study include anything on the security force assistance teams or the MIT teams that were out there contributing?
So I did not. And part of the reason for that is the unfortunate nature of the dissertation. And within political science, they really want you to be able to compare apples to apples, to be able to assess the effect of the variables. Because they consider, okay, well, if you look at, for example, a MIT team compared to an SF team, the type and quality of the advisors are so different that it affects the variable, for example, of consistency. It affects the variable of the number of advisors, and it would be difficult to make a conclusion based upon that. Like, for example, your best category might be 20 host nation soldiers to one advisor for special forces. That might be a totally different number for MIT teams or other teams. I will say I did study that a little bit when I was one of the co-authors and then later senior editors and eventual director of the Iraq War Study Project. And I mean, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. But that wasn't central to my dissertation.
Perfect. I appreciate you just, kind of clarifying that for our audience. So can you give us a little bit about your findings?
Yeah. So this was one that was in some ways, it was kind of hard for me because, I am a linguist. I had trained extensively in Arabic. I love speaking it. I grew up in South Florida. And so I went to kind of a progressive school. Again, this is, the 70s, right? And we had Spanish every day in school. every day. And it was an immersion Spanish. It was like a sink or swim. And so I'm a 3-3 Spanish speaker as well, 3-3-3 across the board. And language is important to me. And so when I started coming across these findings of, that it's not essential to be able to speak the host nation language to be able to produce combat effective partners. It was hard for me. It was hard for me because it kind of ran counter to my grain, right? Counter to my core identity and everything that I trained years of my life, like blood, sweat, and tears to learn foreign languages. And then here I was like, well, what did I do? Like waste my life? But that's a little sarcastic, a little facetious, because the general conclusion that I came to was the one that I just kind of, tipped off a little bit. And that is that it is not essential to be able to speak the host nation language to be able to produce combat effective partners. Now, there's been a nuance and there's exceptions to that, but that's really the core rule. Kind of in the Philippines, while there was a match to the language and the cultural awareness of the advisors to the host nation, oddly enough, the effectiveness of the ISOF and many other forces was better than the Philippine light reaction regiment, which is their SOF that was trained. And so it's like, okay, well, if language training wasn't the critical factor, what was? The language training, it was really interesting. Because obviously there were some exceptions and nuances, but really what I came across eventually with was that what is most important are two factors, and that is consistency in advisor pairing, and that is sending the same advisors back to work with the same host nation units time after time after time. And that was absolutely the most important factor in whether the host nation forces became combat effective. The second one was the ratio of the number of host nation partners or soldiers to advisors. And an interesting finding there was that there is the U.S. doctrine, the kind of conventional wisdom is that one ODA of 12 individuals trains a battalion of host nation forces. And that's kind of sacrosanct. It's holy grail type stuff that if you even speak of it like or to oppose it, you have to speak in quiet voices because you think somebody's going to come out of the woodwork to assassinate you. And the interesting thing was that in almost all of the cases, the ratio was not an ODA training a battalion. It was an ODA training a company or even a platoon. An order of magnitude of 3 to 9 times different from the doctrinal standard. So that to produce a combat effective partner force, you kind of had to throw doctrine out the window and dedicate a lot more advisors to the mission than we thought initially was necessary. And those were kind of the principal findings. Other than, I think it's really worth exploring some of the detail, kind of the fine print, so to speak, on the language training and cultural awareness finding.
Frank, one question, you were talking about the consistency in pairing in your research. Just out of curiosity, how many times did you see that the same people were partnering with the same partners?
So it depended on the mission. And now where it became a really important variable to look at. In Iraq, it was extensive. And in many cases, 5th group and 10th group were doing almost back-to-back rotations for a significant portion of the mission. And the individuals forward would establish communications with those in the rear so that they were reading the same reports. They knew what was going on. They were up to date with the progress that had been made. And they showed back up. And many things were impacted by that. Number one is they knew where the host nation was at, so they didn't have to restart from scratch again. No frustration on the part of the host nation, no frustration on the part of the advisors. They knew where the host nation was. No lost or wasted time. Second is the host nation, they knew the partners. They knew their SF partners. And they welcomed them as brothers. They developed such close bonds that things that might oftentimes be difficult to approach, whether they be culturally or just personally or whatever, many times shame honor societies, it's difficult to admit mistakes. The longer they had gotten to know them, it became easier to bring up those difficult topics. Those difficult topics of like, you know, uh, Lieutenant Ali in 3rd Platoon, we're seeing some stuff that, he might be connected with Jaish al-Mahdi, and we're kind of, there are some kind of concerns about him. Maybe he's not really a good fit for the commandos. Maybe he should go find another line of work. And then, the host nation might say, if they developed enough trust and connections and friendship with the advisors, rather than reject them out of hand as, oh, you're the ugly American, you don't know anything. I'm here. This is my job. They might say, you know what? You're right. I was kind of thinking the same thing too. And that had a really huge impact. It also, in some cases, in when the relationships even weren't as positive, it prevented the host nation from kind of, so to speak, pulling the wool over the advisors' eyes, because the advisors would be like, okay, this is my 5th tour. The guys 2 times ago tried to do this to me. I'm not falling for that again. So nice try, guys, but a valiant effort. But no, we're not doing that. So that had a huge impact on just the ability to produce combat effective partners.
Thanks for expanding on that. Just to switch regions, because I know you said in your studies you looked at the Philippines and Colombia. Could you expand a little bit more on Colombia, and what were your findings there with the partnerships?
Yeah, so Colombia is the exception in terms of language training. And in general terms, the Colombian SOF became the most effective partner force that in many cases were as good or better than many NATO allies. Basically, a top 5 international, like globally top 5 SOF that in many cases, when they had the international competitions, that the Colombians win. There are these great stories of Americans where we're like, we are taking dudes or taking SF advisors, SF soldiers out of the rotation cycle. We're just going to train for this competition for 6 to 9 months. That's the only thing they're doing because we want to win. And then the Colombians still beat us. And one of the things that's really important to take away from this is that at the time that the project starts in the late 90s, Colombia is in bad shape. There are Colombians who are thinking that the country is going to fracture and break off into like essentially a Farkistan, or the FARC controlled area where it effectively became its own country. There are individuals that think the government is going to fall, that the country is going to collapse. The murder rate and the kidnapping rate in Colombia in the late 90s was worse than Afghanistan. Okay. So Colombia was in bad shape. And, we were fortunate to have really, really good partners in Colombia. At the same time, there were things that we did that had a positive impact. That ratio, again, was low. It is close to an ODA advising a company. And at times, even in the earlier phases where an ODA was advising a host nation platoon as they stand up Bacoa and Aglan, 2 elite forces, which I looked at. Essentially commandos, and then the Agrupación de Lanceros, the Lancero group, or that they took the Lanceros from being just a school to a battalion-sized force. Colombia was the shining star where they're soft little rock stars. And that was one of the exceptions where language did matter. And it was interesting because there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg, right? Like, and this is an important kind of caveat to kind of look at for a second, is because with the exception of Spanish, okay, there is this mystique of, SF soldiers, SF guys and gals, they speak the foreign language. They're great. And you watch the Green Berets, the cheesy, section where all the individual NCOs give their introduction in their target language. And in reality, that's probably all the language they know, and they probably worked at it for memorizing it for probably a couple weeks in advance. Because the dirty little secret is that, again, with the exception of Spanish, most SF soldiers don't really speak the host nation language well. So even in the cases of, for example, of 5th Group in Iraq, or the third group, when they were building up some host nation language speakers, Dari, Pashto, whatever, those that did speak it, the host nation language, didn't speak it well. And just to give you like an interesting statistic, and these are from USASOC. As of 2021, in terms of Arabic speakers across the entire regiment, this is the whole regiment, everyone, even those old 06s like I was in a garrison somewhere, there are only 45 2-2 Arabic speakers. And that's a 2 on the OPI, not the GLPT. There are 12 3-3s. That's it. In terms of Farsi, there are 4 2-2 speakers. French, 74 2-2 and 31 3-3s. Again, across the whole regiment. The sole exception is Spanish, where you have 244 2-2 speakers and 94 3-3 speakers. And this, again, is a mid-2021. So, to me, that further strengthened the finding that, to produce a combat effective partner like the ISOF or the commandos, it's not essential to speak the host nation language. Because not only were there, the groups very rarely paired, even the individuals within the group didn't really speak the language all that well, most of them. The graduating requirement now is 1+1+. During the wars, 0+0+ was the graduation requirement. And a 0+0+, man, you can barely ask how to get to the bathroom with a 0+0+. You have really limited skills. And in many cases, 0+0+, a lot of individuals got that by answering all B's or all C's. Was literally the technique that I had individuals in my classes who were doing, because they knew that if you got all B's, there's this, I don't know whether it was conventional wisdom or, drug dealer story, that if you did that, you would pass. You would get a 0+0+, and you wouldn't get kicked out of the regiment. So it really is interesting. The exception, again, is Spanish, and that's a critical nuance to take. And it's hard to know where or whether it was kind of, a chicken or egg kind of scenario, whether there was an expectation from the host nation that the Colombians basically said, hey, we expect you guys to show up speaking Spanish, or whether there was a certain point of pride that had developed within the Red Empire, as seventh group is known, or La Familia, that Spanish was a regimental point of pride, that they were the one group where people actually spoke the host nation language and really spoke it. And you can make there are some arguments on why that is the case, because of the number of Latinos that serve in the U.S. military that are attracted to seventh group, perhaps the general ease of learning Spanish compared to something like Farsi, Russian, Arabic, Mandarin. But for whatever reason, there certainly were a lot of Spanish speakers in seventh. And it became, whether an expectation on the host nation or from the group, they had to speak Spanish to advise. And they trained in it. They prepared for it. They gave their pre-mission briefings in Spanish. They did their rehearsals in Spanish. So it had an impact. But again, even there, and in the case of the Philippines, where there was a match, first group almost exclusively did the light reaction regiment in the Philippines. Many advisors told me, look, it gets complicated once you scratch below the veneer, because in many cases you would have, for example, an NCO who had been in third group, who wanted to homestead at Bragg, who before the move of seventh group down to Pensacola, again, this is most of this time period, they are at Bragg. They jump back and forth between third and seventh group. So you have a third group French speaker on a team that's in seventh group. Or there are cases where there were team sergeants, again, because they're trying to cross-pollinate between the groups, team sergeants or company commanders or company sergeant majors who didn't speak any Spanish, who are in leadership roles. And so it gets complicated, but at least in the Colombia situation, it did appear that there was a factor. But even in that case, and in the Philippines, I had many individuals, and again, 2-2 or 3-3 speakers who told me, hey, you know what? It really didn't matter, because in many cases, the host nation wanted to practice their English. They took it as, hey, this is my chance to learn English better, to improve my marketability globally. And, in the Philippines, there are occasions where, guys would talk in Tagalog or Filipino, and then the host nation refused to speak in their language and spoke purely in English so that, again, they could learn and develop. Similar stories also in Colombia and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where there were some, tutus and higher. Even some of those told me, hey, to build, and again, this is where a nuance is critical, right? We're not teaching a senior staff college level, right? We're building an elite partner force, a force to, advance with, to fight the enemy, to combat the enemy, a combat force, right? I had 2 2s, 3 3s telling me, yeah, you know what? It really didn't matter, because what was important was training them in the combat skills. And there was some bleed over between the consistency and advisor pairing, because they told me that individuals who were on their, third, fourth, fifth rotation, they've picked up enough of the critical dialogue to be able to do the key elements of the training. And that, combined with the number of individuals who knew, English or wanted to speak English, that speaking the host nation language became less important in every case other than Colombia. And even in Colombia, there were exceptions.
Frank, it's funny because I've experienced something similar with the Colombians. I've worked with a Colombian officer that had learned English in the past. So he was like, hey, speak to me in English. I want to speak English. He wants to practice his English. In your studies, I had one question. Did you break down the demographics? I know you spoke about, a lot of Latinos join the military and have access to be able to, get into seventh group. How about like Filipino Americans? I grew up in Southern California, and I know a lot of Filipino Americans join the Navy. Not sure what the demographics are in the Army. Any findings in your research about that?
Nothing more than anecdotal. And unfortunately, that was one of the things that, so I tried to ask him, like, okay, Yusasa, can you provide me the statistics of this that are matched to the language skills, right? So that I can make decent conclusions. And one is Yusasa they were not really keen on even sharing that. And to be honest, they were kind enough to share the language scores, but they did not share the breakdown. There certainly was some anecdotal evidence of, Filipinos going into the first group, or a decent number of Korean Americans going to first group. And it's just actually interesting. There's this interesting statistic where on Korean there are only like 5 2 2s, but then there are like 23 3s, which again I strongly suspect. I mean, I don't know because I don't have the data, but I strongly suspect that all those 3 3s are Korean American.
Yeah, I'm sure you're saying
Yeah.
3 3s. Yeah, I'm sure your hunch is pretty right. So Frank, I've learned a lot speaking to you on this topic here. So, in closing, what are some of the big takeaways for our listeners today?
Yeah. So the first one is that don't walk away with a bumper sticker, PowerPoint deep kind of conclusion that there's no value in language training, because there is inherent value in language training. A couple of things that conclusions for that were that knowing one language helps you learn another language more easily. And so that over time, individuals, even if they were 1 1s or 1+1+, that knowing that first language, that by the fourth or fifth time they were on the same mission, returning to the same host nation forces in the same country, knowing that first language allowed them to pick up the key and most important linguistic elements more quickly. Knowing a foreign language also helps with empathy, key elements that are important in advising foreign forces. To be a good advisor, you have to be empathetic. And knowing a foreign language helps you with that. It gives you patience, right? Because like, man, like I'm a dummy learning Arabic and it's hard. And when you see the host nation working really hard to learn English, you're like, man, these guys are awesome, and it gives you more connections. Second is that these findings about language not being critical or not being essential, okay, they could be enhancing, okay, for sure, especially in the case of Colombia, but they are applied to the topic of security force assistance, building a combat, building a soft partner force. Anytime you go outside of that, whether it be building a logistics element, building a senior staff college, building a joint headquarters, the conclusions, that's not what this study was about. So don't draw those same conclusions for those different cases. That's an apples to oranges comparison. This is just about building a soft partner force where it wasn't as critical. Now, it might be, but I think you'd really have to study one of those other cases to really be able to make those conclusions. And I guess, one of the conclusions, I think, one of the really kind of the big takeaways is that language is a little more fungible than we thought it was. In that if you speak a foreign language, that's what's important, and it's not as critical to make sure that you match the country that you're going to be in. Okay, and I think this is one of the things that there's perennially kind of within, I think, DoD and within the SOF community, there's this hand wringing, right, of what languages do we need to teach for the next 15, 20 years. And it's this unfortunate scenario where, as I think we alluded to earlier about third group in Afghanistan, where by the time the institution catches up with the changes, the geostrategic situation has changed yet again. And what was important is no longer important. And so it's kind of this continual, dog chasing the car or trying to play catch up. And with that, the fungibility of language, I think that there's a value in like taking a deep breath, right? And knowing that, okay, so there are probably a couple languages that we know that are going to be important for the future. Russian, Arabic, Farsi, Mandarin, probably go-tos for a while. Beyond that, maybe we shouldn't worry about and stress as much about it and try to tweak the system, mid-course, because there is this inherent value in language training, and it's not as critical to build a partner force than we originally thought it was. So I guess that's the takeaway for me.
Oh, that was great. And you really hit something important, because the institutional changes take a lot more time to change compared to being an operational unit on the ground. Really good. Frank, I want to thank you for your time, your contribution to this ever-evolving topic of languages, specifically in SOF and RSOF, and support for military operations and building partner capacity. Before we leave, any recommended readings for our audience?
There's some good stuff on it's called The Dictator's Army. Unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank on the author. That really captures the challenges of autocratic regimes and the weaknesses of them. I really like Michael Gordon's recent book. The title is, I believe, Deny and Destroy, the new book on the later years of the Iraq War and Syria. And I mean, I'll still plug, the U.S. Army and the Iraq War. I think there's still value in that. And I know it's 1,500 pages, but there's an overall conclusion chapter and there's 4 smaller conclusion chapters, as well as you can kind of just do searches and look for, because it's all PDF now. You can do a search for a subject that you're interested in, whether it be reconstruction, civil affairs, special forces, or detention, which I think is a really important topic that we haven't really looked at since the end of World War II, and that continues to get more and more complicated. That is going to need some sort of good answer that we don't have right now.
Frank, thank you. And I'm looking forward to it. And, I'm going to read the Iraqi report.
Thanks, Travis. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day. I really appreciate you having me on.
The One CA Podcast is a production of the Civil Affairs Association. Now, special thanks to Assad Raza for guest hosting and Frank Sobchak for coming on. If you or someone you know would like to come on the show or guest host, contact us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have that address in the show notes. I will also have links to the Civil Affairs Association website and Assad.Frank's bios in the show notes. So, thank you for listening to the One CA Podcast, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.